I'm Joe Devine, welcome to the Tifo Football podcast. Recently on our YouTube channel, we've covered a number of teams from La Liga in our Tactics Explained series. We've done that with the assistance of La Liga journalist Simon Harrison, who's very familiar with the teams and has a great knowledge of tactics in Spain. Today I spoke to him about each of those teams that we've covered, that's Barcelona, Valencia, Real Betis and Villarreal. And also, he gives us a promo of the Tactics Explained video that's out later this week on Las Palmas, who are currently bottom of La Liga. Before we get started, I just want to remind listeners that our second podcast, This Football Life, has now launched. The first 2 episodes are live as we speak. For one, Josh spoke to Bruce Grobbelaar, who was Liverpool legend and goalkeeper. He talks about his career in football and also the time that he spent in the army. And for the second episode, Josh spoke to Rob Swire, who was Manchester United's head physio under Sir Alex Ferguson for a couple of decades. And that's also a fascinating listen. So please do go and give those 2 episodes listens. Give the podcast a subscribe as well, that would really help us out. And thanks very much for downloading this episode as well. Hope you enjoy. The obvious talking point with regards to Barcelona is their switch to a 4-4-2 under Ernesto Valverde. Under Pep Guardiola, Barcelona became synonymous with the tiki-taka style and came to represent the peak of attacking football in Europe somewhat. So Valverde's more reserved and balanced system seems an obvious departure from that. So Simon, is it a completely different Barcelona, or is it merely a structural shift with similar philosophical touchstones?
Well, I mean, there's been a fair amount of different Barcelonas. I mean, it's easy to obviously look back all the time to the tiki-taka. That's sort of the golden era. That's when you saw the best of Barcelona, the best with Pep Guardiola, the best with so many star players at their peak. But I mean, since then, you've since had Luis Enrique, who did very well, who was almost, a victim of his own success. He went with a 4-3-3, but it was very different to tiki-taka. It was more direct when they're playing out from the back. They did it very quickly, and it made them really predictable. So now it's taken a shift from, you had the Luis Enrique, the direct 4-3-3. He then changed to a 3-4-3, which I think is ridiculous, Jordi Alba kind of sitting on the bench for months at a time sort of thing. Now it's back to, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of when certain players are back fit and he's got a full complement and who he chooses to buy during the January window. But now it's very much more of this 4-4-2, or there's more of this almost 4-3-1-2 when you're in possession, with Paulinho having a lot of license to get forward. But it's a different Barcelona. I mean, you can say that the concepts in terms of they want control, they want to have a lot of the ball, those are things which I think will always be the case with Barcelona. The one thing I suppose where Valverde could fall foul, it's the fact that they are quite risk averse, they are more balanced, they are a little bit more realistic. And obviously, if this season, for example, if he were to pick up a lot of trophies, would he then become a victim of his own success, where the manner of how you win things then becomes the key point, really? I mean, for right now, if Barcelona, they're coming out of a year where they perhaps didn't perform as well as they would have expected. If they to go and pick up 1-2 trophies this season, I think next season, that's when you'll maybe have Valverde asked, do we need to play in a way that kind of pleases the crowd a bit more? Does it need to be more of this, almost Guardiola style?
It's interesting that, isn't it? I think that's something that only really affects big teams, and you can see it in the Premier League with Manchester United recently. The other thing I wanted to touch on there was that when you talked about Luis Enrique, I know that it's accurate that you describe him as having done very well at Barcelona, but there's almost a perception that isn't really the case, isn't it? Is that just because he's come after such a successful period with Guardiola?
Well, it's always going to be a difficult act to follow in general. I mean, obviously, there were... It's hard to say. I mean, with Enrique, it was very much more, I suppose the word would be, in the kind of modern context, pragmatic. I don't really know quite what pragmatic's meant to mean anymore, but in terms of that, it's a bit more reserved, maybe a bit more, you can see the clear idea coming through it. With Enrique, there was definitely no particular hallmark about it. It wasn't, this team was a very good team. It had some very good players in it under Enrique, but you're not going to be talking about in 10 years, the Enrique style, Enrique's Barca. You're going to be talking about Lionel Messi's Barcelona. I think that's going to be the thing with Barca in general, is that you had the Guardiola era, but since then it's been the Messi era, and obviously Messi's been big under Guardiola, but it was almost as if the identity could sort of sit above Messi to a degree. Now it's more, every manager that's been in since, it's been how can they incorporate Messi the best, and that's ultimately why I think when you're looking back on this in 10, 20 years, it's going to be, do you remember that season when Lionel Messi scored X number of goals? Do you remember when Lionel Messi scored this goal in this game? It won't potentially be, even though Luis Enrique did very well, he's not going to be remembered particularly for anything too ideologically. He's not really going to remember for much. And it depends. I mean, Valverde could go the same way because he's a very safe pair of hands. He's very intelligent. He's astute. He's just fantastic in press conferences. He's a really nice guy, everything like that. But, I mean, ultimately, when he's not coming professing to play a certain way and he's leaving it to, the likes of Messi and that to add these flourishes to his system, you do wonder whether he'll be a bit of, overshadowed. But that's not to say that he's not doing a fantastic job, because, I mean, he absolutely is.
We talked about Lionel Messi there. He obviously gets a lot of the plaudits for the team, and rightly so. But one of the other players that I wanted to discuss, that we also showcased in the video, was Luis Suarez and his positional use within the team. Because you showed how he can effectively shut off space from the opposition by closely marking a centre-back. So I wondered if you could take us through this in a little bit more detail, because it isn't always what people would immediately associate with Suarez. Goals are the obvious thought, but his defensive contributions, or attacking, depending on how you look at them, are key in this system, aren't they?
Well, I think that Luis Suarez, he'll always be prepared to, work for the team. I mean, playing for his nation, for Uruguay, they're always known to be very tenacious, a battling team. Under Valverde at Barca this season, everyone's very much, it's more of a balanced unit. There's more cohesion. You look to Madrid, you look to the capital, and you see that Zinedine Zidane, they don't really look like a team. They look like more of a collection of talented individuals, and right now that's not been enough for them. With Barcelona, everyone's pulling in the same direction, everyone's working hard. You're more likely to see, for example, if the likes of Paco Alcacer isn't scoring goals, if Luis Suarez isn't scoring goals, his teammates will try and help facilitate that. It won't be a case of someone else's ego getting in the way. In terms of how he would work back defensively, I mean, obviously this Barcelona team, it depends week to week. Sometimes they do press very, very high. Other times they sit back a little bit more. The one thing to stress about Valverde is that he is quite reactive. He is not afraid to change things during games, and he's not afraid to, see a trigger that he can then press on and look to make the most of. But in terms of pressing a centre-half, I mean, what Barcelona do look to do, I think this was especially prevalent against Celta Vigo recently, where they did drop points, but Celta Vigo, they like to play out from the back, they like to have a lot of the ball. They've got a former Barcelona coach as their manager at the moment in Giancarlo Unzue. And ultimately, I think Luis Suarez, being that tenacious player, being that sort of terrier who will battle for the ball, and he will be quite nasty. I mean, he's not really hid that for many years, has he? But when he's on the shoulder of that last man, it kind of forces central defenders to play into a certain area of the field. And say, for example, if Celta play out to their right centre half, if they do sort of allow almost that centre half to have a little bit of time, it's only really to allow them a bit of time to set their sights and ultimately see that they're going to be putting a ball into an area which is probably going to be under quite careful observation. And ultimately, with Suarez coming in on someone's shoulder, it kind of says to them, well, you're going to have to probably play a risky pass over to your fullback on the opposite side of the field, or you're going to have to hit it a bit long and try and gamble. And when you've got players like Gerard Piqué and Umtiti, they're really, really colossal and good in the air. So you want to kind of be forcing teams to play up into those kind of areas. And similarly, if you're asking the centre-half to kind of clip the ball over to his fullback, in a time when that ball's in the air, the centre-back likely won't be drilling it because it will be too much of a risk. The rest of the team can kind of shuffle across, and ultimately the fullback's just posed with the exact same situation as the centre-back just had. So it does make things interesting. It forces these teams to really try and play neat triangles. That's something which Celta were capable of in that game. They've got some really good central midfielders, Celta Vigo. But against some of the teams that are more limited, they're going to struggle to break down Barcelona, and ultimately that's when the likes of Messi and Suarez, their hard work up top, it's going to really frustrate teams who haven't got maybe as much quality in terms of ball-playing centre-halves.
You mentioned Valverde there being quite reactive, I suppose in the sense that Barcelona now don't approach every opponent in the same way, although they make changes during the game, as you mentioned. Now, to some, this would seem sensible, or maybe pragmatic, picking up on that word from earlier, looking to attack specific weaknesses or waylay particular strength of the opposition. It does seem like a good way to manage games, but other people would call that reactive in a way that isn't befitting of a side like Barcelona, or they would just generally be negative about it, as we've seen with teams like Manchester United in the Premier League as well. So I wonder, where do you come down on this?
Well, for me, I think you can easily kind of... You could say, okay, this is Barcelona, they've got X amount of money, they can invest this, they've got Lionel Messi, why should they be changing week to week? It should be down to the opposition to come and set up and try and frustrate them. But I think Valverde is just a breath of fresh air in the fact that he's not afraid to, try and gain ground here and there. Ultimately, I think in bigger games, if you've got a team that's just going to go out and play one way, they're going to get kind of flummoxed in really big games. And I think that El Clasico recently, on the 23rd of December, that's when you kind of saw what a difference it makes having a manager that can make changes, that's clever, that's astute, because Zinedine Zidane, he put out the wrong team to begin with, and then during the game, they didn't really appear to... you've got Isco sat on the bench for the entirety of an El Clasico. While you can say, if it was for a greater good, for a big style of play and the way that Real Madrid should always play, then you can kind of say, okay, well, maybe that's a sacrifice worth making. But Valverde compared to Zidane, Zidane hasn't got really a set way of playing. He hasn't shown in games that he can change things, and ultimately, I think Valverde's management, and especially his substitutions in El Clasico and beforehand in other games, he can change the game by putting the right man into the pitch, and whether that means a like-for-like change, whether that means bringing on a striker but potentially playing him wide, reshuffling the midfield a little bit, maybe moving a player like Denis Suarez a bit more out wide rather than playing him centrally, whether it enables Nelson Semedo to come off the bench at right back and it pushes Sergio Roberto up into midfield to give them more energy. I think it just makes them a much more dangerous tool, because ultimately they're not only reliant on their players, that they can be reliant on their manager. And I think that is sort of where Real Madrid have stumbled this season, in that they're reliant on their players. They're not reliant on Zidane.
Well, Ousmane Dembele has returned from injury as well now. So how do you expect this to affect the setup of Barcelona? Because some people, particularly in the comments of the YouTube video, are suggesting that might see a return to a 4-3-3.
I could definitely see that happening. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, because I think, well, first of all, he'll be on the bench, you would think. They've not really risked him. They've let him have over 100 days of recovery. They didn't rush him back for El Clasico. So it kind of suggests that they're going to take things steady. So it might be interesting to see in games, when he is brought on, do Barcelona then look to change? Do they look to kind of shuffle? Do they look to change to a 4-3-3? These are going to be the clues that we'll have to pick up on fairly soon when Dembele's back involved. But I could definitely see them return to a 4-3-3. As long as the balance is still there, and as long as Dembele buys into what the rest of the team are doing in terms of working back and offering balance, then absolutely I could see that working. But by the same... It would be interesting to see in terms of Iniesta, because Iniesta has played on the left-hand side of a midfield four. It takes a little bit of the pressure off him. He doesn't have to maybe work quite as hard. It doesn't ask as much from ageing legs. If Dembele is then on the left-hand side, on the left wing, it might force Iniesta to do a bit more work in terms of running back, chasing back, shuffling in, but not just to make things happen, but also defensively. And ultimately as well, it's worth mentioning Jordi Alba, not too long ago, I think last month, he gave an interview where he said, as bad as it was to lose Neymar in such circumstances, he's in arguably the best form that he's been in for the last couple of years, 3 years maybe. So it'll be interesting to see, does Valverde want to potentially play Dembele out on the left-hand side, and it could have a negative impact on what Alba's been up to with Iniesta lately. But Dembele definitely offers something which Barcelona don't have, and that is just raw pace. And that's not to kind of... That's not to go with this stereotype of a winger that's got tricks. He has pace which not many players in this Barcelona squad have. So at first that could be a bit of a curse rather than a blessing. He might be used more as an impact sub, and I guess we'll see from there.
Okay, well, let's move on to the subject of our second video now, which was on Valencia. The club are experiencing a bit of a revival at the moment under their coach Marcelino. They had a few difficult years under a string of managers, including Gary Neville, of course, but they switched now to a 4-4-2 under their new boss. So, Simon, what is the shift here? Is the squad much the same under Marcelino? Is it just the system that's a success, or are there particular players making a difference too?
Well, it's a mixture of the two. I mean, I think when Marcelino took over in the summer, it was very clear that there would be a big shift, but maybe not that there would be a shift to this extent in terms of the results they've picked up, in terms of the feeling around the club, in terms of confidence, just everything. I think everyone expected an improvement and an upturn, but they didn't expect to, be going into the new year sat in the top four with Champions League football a possibility. I mean, I think people were maybe thinking, okay, we might be an outside shot for the Europa League. But with him bringing in this 4-4-2, it's very balanced, it's very organised. It's basically meant that throughout the entire season, Valencia, they haven't looked like they're really out of a game at any particular point. They've managed to take points from Barcelona, they've taken points from Real Madrid, they've taken a point from Atleti on the opening day of on one of their opening home games at Mestalla. And ultimately, they can just compete with everyone. Marcelino's come in, he's made sure that everything is much more there's much more focus, there's a lot more discipline. Players in terms of what they're eating, in terms of keeping track of their weight and that having an effect. I mean, he said that obviously if a player's a pound overweight, he's not going to not play him on the weekend, but it's good that the players are sort of looking after themselves, and that's obviously going to put them in the best position to play well. But I mean, it's the Marcelino effect in terms of the organisation, in terms of being demanding. Immediately, what he sees and what he wants from his teams in terms of commitment, in terms of effort, in terms of battling, in terms of everything really, that's something that the fans have immediately identified with. It's what they've been crying out for a couple of years, in terms of what kind of commitment and what kind of effort they want from their players on the pitch, to kind of just leave it all on the pitch. They want them to battle and fight, and as we saw in the last game of the year when they lost against Villarreal, the crowd still gave them a standing ovation, even though they'd lost their first home game of the season. So it's just generally an upturn of belief. The 4-4-2 is important because it makes sure they're compact. It makes sure that teams can't come to Mestalla and break them down easily. And then when you've got the likes of Goncalo Guedes, you've got, Zaza staying around, having bought him and paid that fee to make it permanent. I mean, it's a combination of the two. The 4-4-2 itself, I'm sure that if they hadn't have strengthened over the summer, they would have been a lot better defensively. They would have been very tough to break down. But definitely the likes of, Guedes, these players, they're the ones that make the difference. They are the ones which make the difference. When your team is playing a counter-attacking style like Marcelino wants, they're the ones that are taking a chance at the other end. And ultimately, it's a combination. It's all the pieces of the puzzle coming together at once for Valencia, and it kind of the only thing that remains to be seen is, one, can they keep their players fit? And two, can they now bounce back from losing that first home game at Mestalla? Because obviously psychologically that's a bit of a big blow.
Well, one of the pieces of that puzzle is Rodrigo Moreno, who plays as a sort of second striker. Marcelino's thinking, as you mentioned in the video, of having two up top is fairly simple and quite interesting as well. When he asks his defenders if they'd rather play against one striker or two, they always say one, which is quite obvious, I suppose, isn't it? So pushing two up clearly causes issues for the opposition defence. Along with Barcelona's 4-4-2, I wondered if it would be fair to call two up top, or even the 4-4-2, as a recent sort of trend in La Liga, or is that going too far? Because from my perspective, I would say that, and I don't really follow La Liga, but from the Premier League, 3 years ago, there was almost no teams playing in a 4-4-2, and it seems to be experiencing some sort of revival, although that could just be me.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in terms of the Premier League recently, I suppose you could say Quique Sanchez-Flores, who is now Espanyol manager, at Watford, he was very much using a 4-4-2, which was kind of interesting in terms of with Dini up top, with Igalo, that they very much played in a kind of way where they would play off each other. Obviously, Dini being the big man, Igalo maybe offering a little bit more in terms of mobility. And really, I don't know if I would necessarily say that it's a trend as such, because you've got Marcelino, he's always sort of peddled this style of play. It just seems to have happened that gradually, as he's been entrusted with bigger teams, better players, bigger jobs, that obviously he has better tools at his disposal to reach that end goal that he's always been looking for. I mean, at Villarreal, he enjoyed great success with the 4-4-2, and really, you're seeing the more or less the same blueprint here, really. I wouldn't say it's the same as Barcelona's in terms of at Barcelona. I find it quite strange, really, their midfield four, in terms of it is really very fluid players. For example, the likes of Ivan Rakitic, he can find himself very wide on the right-hand side. Similarly, he could find himself quite tucked in. It is really quite malleable. With this, it's more the job roles are more. It's kind of more rigid in terms of that you have Kondogbia. He's seen as more of a screen for the defence. He will do more of the dirtier work defensively, but similarly, he's very, very good on the ball too, so it's not as if he harms them in any way. Parejo, he's very much asked to be the main playmaker. He's keeping the ball moving, he's circulating everything, he's making things happen in midfield. From set pieces, obviously, he's very good too. And then out wide, I mean, I suppose you could argue that with Barcelona's midfield four, that Iniesta comes inside, he looks to cause some problems, and Alba goes flying down the left flank on the overlap. And I suppose that is where you can kind of see some similarities with Valencia, in terms of if the build-up plays quite slow, they will ask and wait for the likes of Jose Luis Gaya or Martin Montoya to come up on the overlap, and both of those can deliver from the wide areas. I mean, Montoya's been criticised defensively, but in terms of his delivery, he can put a ball in. But the one thing which I think is completely different to Barcelona in terms of the wide men is just that bit of pace. I mean, Carlo Guedes, we've seen him score some outrageous goals on the break this season. He's just got, when he puts his foot down, he's kind of just gone. And Barcelona don't really have a player necessarily like that in that same kind of area. But I mean, I would definitely say that 4-4-2, it's something that a lot of teams are using now to play on the counter-attack. You can see it in La Liga in terms of Getafe have done very, very well this season with a similar sort of system. But equally, there's teams playing the same style, such as Girona. They're playing with more of a 3-5-2 of sorts. And I think really the trend is counter-attacking it. The trend is ensuring that number 10s, this isn't the area in La Liga for number 10s. Everything's very compact in between the lines, and then you look to break and do the damage while the opposition is stuck with more men behind the ball than they would ideally want, I suppose.
Okay, well, sticking with the 4-4-2, but talking about defence, we also looked in the video at how Valencia defend compactly. One of the things they do is forcing opponents to make long diagonal balls over the top in an attempt to make progress up the field, or even just to keep the ball. And it struck me that this isn't dissimilar from something that Alex and I talked about regarding Burnley a few weeks back. Burnley position their defenders to encourage longer shots on goal and to try and funnel the shots directly towards the keeper, so they're more likely to save them. And that comes out interestingly in the stats. You see obviously that they concede a lot of shots on goal, but their goalkeeper is always at the top of the saves list as well. And since Burnley also play with a 4-4-2, this might be quite a difficult question to answer, but is it fair to call their system similar to Valencia's? Are there the hallmarks that would seem similar, or is that far too general?
I mean, you could say in terms of, I suppose, the concepts but behind it would be the same in terms of that you want to stay compact in between the lines. You would probably want to stay quite narrow as a unit, because ultimately if you're playing as a narrow unit, say with your back four and with another bank of four just ahead of them, I mean, you're kind of inviting and you're kind of funneling the other team to look wide, because that's where the space is. And ultimately, these two teams, I suppose, with Burnley or Valencia, you know, they're looking to just be frustrating. They're looking to play on the break. They're looking to kind of do their damage in. They might not necessarily have a huge amount of chances. I mean, there have been some games this season where Valencia have created a lot. I mean, against Villarreal most recently, they created a lot of chances, and really they just couldn't be clinical. But, I mean, they wouldn't mind at all if they were to win 1-0 from one breakaway and score once. I mean, it's just, I suppose the mentality is sort of the same. I mean, Neto, I would really say he's not really tested all too much from range. I think that Valencia are just very, very set on getting the ball wide. And I think really they can sort of trust in the likes of Jason Murillo or Ezequiel Garay or Gabriel Paulista. They're all good in the air, these central defenders. And ultimately, these kind of systems, that they protect limited defenders and make them potentially look a bit better than they are. I mean, you can maybe get away with having a more limited central defender, but if he is, you know, not having to move potentially more than 10 yards either side, unless you're caught out with a ball in behind the lines, you know, you can make them look very, very good. I mean, you could say in terms of the team which won the Premier League from Leicester, I mean, Wes Morgan and Robert Huth, if they were maybe exposed a bit more, if they played a higher line, if they were maybe dragged out and asked to cover across a little bit more, I mean, I don't think that defence would have been as watertight if Ranieri maybe had sallied forth a little bit more.
No.
But so I suppose
you could also even take the example from Burnley. In fact, last season, Ben Mee and Michael Keane had very similar stats, and if you looked solely at that, you would assume that perhaps even Ben Mee was the superior player in some of those categories. That's obviously, it's quite a comment to make, but that's obviously not so much the case. But then I suppose the opposition to that would be, well, play them in the way that they're going to play best. And, why would you play a player in a position or in a style in which they wouldn't succeed? It doesn't make any sense, does it?
Exactly. I mean, it's just, to mention pragmatic yet again, but it's just logical. It just makes sense. I mean, if you've got defenders, for example, I mean, now with Burnley having lost Keane, I mean, you come in with someone like James Tarkowski. He's just a strong player, good in the air, very uncompromising, and ultimately, you kind of, if potentially Burnley were playing out from the back, there would be maybe a list of 10 attributes that you would want from this player. If Burnley are playing a 4-man defence and they're playing very narrow, you could probably cut that list in two, because you won't be needing him to do such a wide range of jobs. I mean, generally they'll be asked to occupy a certain space, and if they can maybe even go just man marking. I mean, I from kind of, well, I suppose, I don't know if I count it as experience really, but having played as a centre half myself, I'd much prefer being able to follow a man and ensure that I was to frustrate that man rather than be, thinking about a lot more than that. I mean, playing in these kind of units, even though it gets the best out of the collective, it does kind of free the individual to be quite one track in what they're thinking. And ultimately, I think when you're playing against these big players and these big teams, if you can kind of reduce the game to one-on-one battles in certain areas, and you've got some players in central defence who are very, very uncompromising on one-on-ones, whether it be aerially, whether it be strong and not allowing players to turn, I mean, you're kind of turning the game into your favour because you're allowing it to be played in these certain 10-yard boxes on the field.
Okay, well, let's move on to Real Betis now. Earlier we talked about Valverde's Barcelona approaching different games in a different way. Quique Setien's Real Betis are arguably the total opposite of that. You describe Setien as someone who has a very clear team identity and is very consistent with that. I found him I didn't really know much about him before this video, but I found it very interesting when I was making it. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about him and his ideas.
Well, it's interesting because you have a lot of, well, in modern football, I suppose, it's always talking about it being a results business. It's always talking about, you can't complain, say, if there was a managerial sacking down to them not picking up the points required. I think Setien is he's just from a completely different era almost, a different train of thought, a different school of thought. He will always play in the same way. When he was a player, he would be a very technically gifted midfielder, and really, it's almost as if his teams are sort of like the dream, what he would have liked to have played in himself, in terms of he likes a very aesthetically pleasing side. He's just uncompromising, but not in a way where you'd kind of maybe expect that, the stereotypes in terms of, okay, the minimum things that I'm demanding each game will be, that you work hard, that you battle, that you show commitment, that you do it for the fans, etc. His is more in terms of, I want this to be enjoyable, I want to be entertained. I remember going to Anoeta earlier in the season, and it was Real Sociedad 4, Real Betis 4, and it was an obscene game. It defied logic. It was just mental. But then he just comes into the press conference afterwards and kind of said, well, I want my team to play this way. We got a point. I would have liked to have been 3, but we've scored goals, we've entertained. And really, that's just what he sticks to, and it's really down to kind of the president or the chairman of these kind of clubs to think, are we prepared to maybe sacrifice the short term to have a bigger long term future with this big identity? I mean, you've said, for example, with Ernesto Valverde, does he have the sort of Barcelona style? Will we see, a reaction to that in the future? And I think we probably will. And it'll be the same with Real Betis, but probably inversely, because you'll have that he'll be sticking to the philosophy and he won't waver. And it depends when the fans get sick of it, really. And I think that's what it will be. If he is to leave Real Betis, it will be because the fans are sick of him, I think. I don't think it will necessarily be the board, I think. When you appoint someone like Setien, you know that long term that's where you're going to be looking, because you need to think, okay, well, he puts his trust in some younger players, he's very possession focused, you need to allow him to get his own personnel in. I mean, during the summer you had the likes of Andres Guardado, Javi Garcia, they even brought in like Jordi Alba at centre back to be better on the ball, Zuel Fidel from Alaves to be better on the ball at the back. And you need to give it time to bed in. But, I mean, everything about him kind of defies logic. I mean, in the modern game, you're expecting, okay, points are what a manager is judged by. And Setien's just happy to sit there and say, judge me on my football.
We talked about Betis always trying to play out from the back as well, which is one of the hallmarks of Setien's system. You know that this does cause issues, and that Betis will presumably sometimes concede after a mistake for fear of booing it outfield or into touch. This is something that was also often discussed about Eddie Howe's Bournemouth, and it can be quite difficult to understand, I think, when you see teams faltering at the back and trying to play it out, conceding in what would seem like an unnecessary fashion to the untrained eye. So to the trained eye, Simon, I just wonder, why is it so important to Setien's system to play out from the back? Since, due to the risk that it incurs, presumably it's crucial.
Yeah, well, there will be some, there will be some unavoidable scenarios where it's kind of, you've got to put it into touch. But it's kind of just the attitude, just to, if it's possible to play out, then do it. And ultimately with these kind of teams, it's because that the coach has got them playing in such a way for such a long period of time, whether it be Bournemouth or Betis, that he's prepared to say, look, this is my way of playing. It's not your fault if this happens. This, we're bound to have some errors. I mean, it's not as if footballers are robots or anything like that. I mean, you're bound to have the odd occasion where someone will potentially play a pass that's just dreadful, or they'll take a poor touch. A goalkeeper will take a poor touch, for example. And this is nothing new with Setien. I mean, at Las Palmas last season, you kind of just had to hold your hand up, and if their goalkeeper's left with egg on his face because he's taken a bad touch and someone scored from it, I mean, it's kind of the idea of, for the, almost the greater good sort of thing, that these things, that they can happen. When they do happen, it's a shame, but it doesn't prove that this system doesn't work. And I think it's more, you've got to hold the faith that if you keep playing this way, you're going to get more rewards than you are going to get, egg on your face with your goalkeeper. I mean, this season you've seen, for Betis, Adan, he's made some mistakes, but ultimately it's just Setien saying, look, I know that potentially maybe the keepers aren't, super comfortable playing out from the back. I mean, in past years at Betis, they've not played out from the back. They've not played attractive football. So for Antonio Adan, after a few years of kind of just being the last bastion in defence and just being asked to do a lot more with his hands and his feet, it's something completely new, but it's a learning process for everyone. And really just with how Las Palmas like to play in terms of getting the ball out to split central defenders, they position their wing backs very high, playing out from the goalkeeper. I mean their central midfield three are all very, very good on the ball always. So it's really just being able to get the ball, transition from defence into midfield, and then look to make things happen with some very talented technical players. That's not to say that sometimes, for example, if there's an oversight on the part of the opposition and there's a clear pass to play with a winger potentially having a chance to get in behind, they'll obviously play it. I mean, but it's kind of, you play it when it's there. You try to always play it, but not to be. You're not going to be completely one-eyed to the point of, say, Mateo Kovacic in El Clasico just following Messi, and to the detriment of a team where Rakitic then strolls through, feeds a pass into Sergio Roberto, and then he allows Luis Suarez to tap home. So there is a balance, but ultimately it's just Setien willing to say, I'm responsible, and for us to play out and from the back and have so much of the ball and to entertain the fans, and for Setien to enjoy watching it ultimately. I mean, they've got to keep playing. I think the time when a Betis team don't play out from the back, that's the sign that they don't believe in Setien anymore, and that's kind of when he would have to go.
Well, another similar function to that as well is the high defensive line. The video shows that the high line, while risky for obvious reasons, is also vital to enable the fullbacks to push up and release the wingers. This touches on a point that we've been keen to make before on this podcast, that whilst attack and defence are often discussed as two different things, more often than not, one function will have purpose in both of those categories. And this is also clear in the case of Real Betis, is it not, that essentially that they're the same thing? Yeah,
I mean, it's massively causal. I mean, in terms of that, you're kind of dictating to the opposition where they need to be pressing, how they need to manipulate their own players. It's very much, a kind of, it is something which is sort of a cliche, I suppose, in Spanish football terms, with the whole a game of chess sort of thing. I mean, this is something that's kind of mentioned with Setien quite a bit. It's obviously for every action that there's going to be a reaction, and it's kind of down to with Betis setting up in the way that they do. It's asking teams to come and press them, and ultimately they've got the faith in themselves that they can sort of exploit that fact and be able to play their way out of trouble anyway, just from the fact that technically they're very good. And really, yeah, I mean, I would say that in terms of playing the high line, when there is a mistake, it's just more obvious. It's an immediate threat. It's not as if centre back too. I mean, they have Zoe Fadali, who's a very good player, and I really like him. But aside from that, I mean, they have Issa Mandi, they have Jordi Amat, and they're not very talented players. And I think that these players, you know, Setien will bring someone in eventually. But for now, I mean, it is very, very uncompromising when they are kind of caught out, when there is a mistake. I mean, Amat's been sent off twice in the last 3 weeks for varying degrees of stupidity. So, you know, it does expose certain players, but I think it's just that long term, you know, they're going to play this system inside out. They're going to be having so much of the ball that even these players who, when Setien arrived, might have thought, am I on my way out here? Like, I've never really played in a style like this before. They'll have played it so much, and it'll just become natural that, you know, maybe to some teams, if Burnley started doing it, you'd think, well, are they going to make mistakes? I mean, is someone going to look nervous if they're given the ball and they're asked to bring it out from the back? Are they going to look nervous with that? And with Betis, I suppose it just becomes second nature. I mean, it just becomes something where it almost, you don't think of it as a risk, because it's normal, and players understand how much space they have around them and when they can have the ball, and they'll have been in these situations so many times where they're so deep or so close to the byline or offering from a goalkeeper that's under such high pressure that I suppose it's just muscle memory at the end of the day.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to Villarreal. So with this team, we have a departure from the 4-4-2 we've seen with some of the previous teams. In fact, current Valencia coach Marcelino once used this system at Villarreal, who was followed by Fran Escriba, who largely tried to maintain those ideas before the current coach, Javi Calleja, switched the team to a 4-3-1-2, which also does look a little bit like a 4-4-2 diamond. How is this system different from what came before, and what do you think of it, Simon?
For me, I mean, it's just a breath of fresh air, because, well, when Marcelino was, it was back at El Madrigal when Marcelino was in charge, so a lot's changed since then. But he would play very much in the same kind of style as he does at Valencia now. So it would be reliant on the wing-backs providing a lot of the width. The wide midfielders they'd be asked to come inside and play as these sort of interiors, so sort of, I would say, a wide playmaker sort of role. And ultimately, you know, they were just great to watch. I think one of the things with Marcelino's Villarreal and even coaches before him, you always knew that the kind of triangles that they could play would be something quite special. And Marcelino always would say that, you know, you're trying to get to this level of automation. You're trying to almost turn your players into semi-robots, I suppose, in terms of in certain situations, in certain scenarios, they're just going to act naturally. They're just going to react as though they've always done it before. In terms of how Javi Calleja has changed things, Fran Escriba, he, as you said, tried to kind of squeeze the last drops out of Marcelino's system. When Escriba came in, it was the week before a Champions League playoff game against Monaco, and Marcelino left because there were kind of arguments with the board over signings, deals not happening, Marcelino being quite abrasive. So Escriba was kind of thrown in as a caretaker, and he managed to prolong, you know, the ideas that Marcelino had. They'd maybe be a little bit tighter at the back, they'd be a little bit more reserved, but ultimately it was sort of the same. But Escriba gradually, I mean, the momentum started to wear out, the wheels fell off, they lost 4-0 away to Getafe, which was unthinkable, and he went. But now with Calleja, I mean, as you've said, it's more of a diamond. I think the most important thing is that Escriba was using Pablo Fornals, who's a really talented Spain under-21 international. They signed him from Malaga in the summer, and he was very, very good for Malaga at the tail end of last season. And he was being played out in like a wide role in this 4-4-2 under Escriba, and it was just a waste. Calleja's come in, he's named this sort of 4-3-1-2, and Fornals is that, you know, that middleman. He connects everything together, and it's just changed everything because he's such a good player. He's such a good young player. They picked him up for really peanuts compared to what they could probably sell him for now. And that's what it kind of all revolves around. They've got some extremely good technical central midfielders. They've got Rodri linked time and time again with a return to Atletico Madrid eventually, maybe in the summer. And it's just more interesting. I think that's the thing. I mean, the lights under Marcelino, it kind of flickered for a season or so. Escriba had been pragmatic, he'd been reserved, he'd been quite tight at the back. but the fans want something different, because ultimately it comes down to the same thing we mentioned before. The fans get bored of watching a certain kind of football for so long, and now under Calleja, he's come in, he's not prepared to give young players a chance. So obviously Rodri was a fixture in midfield anyway, but you've got Fornals, they're building around Fornals, which is interesting. They've got Dani Rabah playing up front. He's a young player, with Calleja having previously worked with the B team. He knows all of these young players. We would have seen more of Leo Suarez, who had previously been at Boca a long time ago, but he's injured his knee ligaments. Otherwise, we would have seen some of him. There's Ramiro Guerra, who's a very good central midfielder. He's played a little bit here and there. You've got Pau Torres, a young central defender. He's just not afraid to promote young players. And ultimately, with the new system, giving Fornals all this responsibility and just giving the young players the belief that they can, make the jump from the B team to the first team, it's just an exciting time, I think, really, to be a Villarreal fan.
Well, let's talk about Fornals then, because he's key to the current setup, as you say. You describe him in the video as playing the enganche role. If he was in the Premier League, would people call him the number 10, or is that simplifying it somewhat?
Well, I think, in terms of the enganche, just in terms of being that link from midfield to attack, he's very much the player that you sort of go through. He's got a fair amount of liberty to sort of go as he sees fit in between the lines, and obviously that's where there's the parallels to the number 10. But there's one kind of problem with that in La Liga at the moment, in that there's a lot of teams that will play 4-4-2s, there's a lot of teams that will play 3-5-2s, and it doesn't allow much space in between the lines. You've got the likes of Isco and Marco Asensio sat on the bench at Real Madrid, and I don't think this would be the case if these teams were coming and maybe being a bit more open. But you could call it a number 10, I suppose. It's just basically entrusting in Fornals and saying, look, you've got the technical ability to beat players, you've got the confidence and the composure to play through balls and see passes that others might not. Similarly, if he's got the chance to pull the trigger, he's not bad in that regard either. He's just a very complete player, and that's why it's maybe not as risky to give him all this responsibility, because he can kind of flit in and out of the game in terms of his spatial sort of awareness and being in the right place at the right time. He's just very, very good, and his way to final ball's brilliant. The only bad thing to say, really, in a Villarreal kind of perspective at the moment, is Javi Calleja has confirmed today that Cedric Bakambu, who's been scoring a lot of goals for them this season, he'll be joining a Chinese Super League team. I think it's Beijing Guoyang for 40 million euros. And he was very much, the man that Fornals would feed in behind. Very, very quick and explosive player. So now it's a new challenge again for Fornals, because he has Carlos Bacca, who's looked very, very good recently. They've got Dani Rabah, a young player. They've got Nicola Sansone, who's coming back from injury. And they've got Enes Unyal, who they'd loaned out to Levante on an emergency loan deal. They've brought him back, I think, knowing that Bakambu would go. So now, the kind of impetus is even more on Fornals, because he needs to get the best out of Unyal. He needs to keep ensuring that, there's that supply line up to Carlos Bacca. But Pablo Fornals, if potentially people may not have really heard too much about him when he was at Malaga, for obvious reasons. Malaga have struggled for the last couple of years. They could go down this year. But really, he was the biggest. They lost some important players during the summer. They lost Sandro Ramirez to Everton. They lost Ignacio Camacho. He moved to the Bundesliga. But very much Fornals, the young player, the big hope, the big star, Spain under-21 international. He went to Poland with that squad in the summer. He's just the main man, and it's refreshing to see that after basically Escribá was keeping the 4-4-2, I think for fear of the fact he had no other ideas himself. Now that that's changed and you've got Fornals, at the rudder of the ship, as it were, it's just exciting, and I think that you're going to hear a lot more about him over the next season, 2 seasons, and I think they bought him for around 11 million euros. Now that there's no way he'd go for any less than 40 or so, I wouldn't say. So, really, we've talked about, say, for example, Lionel Messi being really important to Barcelona, and almost, the identity being, to an extent, sort of sidelined by that. It wouldn't be crazy for Fornals to become that important for Villarreal. Since Escribá has gone, he's looked fantastic. He scored his first goal for the club as well, and there's a lot to be excited about in terms of Fornals, definitely.
Okay, finally on Villarreal, something which we've seen with this team, which we've actually seen with every team that we've discussed today, is that the fullbacks are key to the system. And for Villarreal, this is as true under Marcelino as it is now under Calleja. I'm keen to get your view as someone who follows La Liga. We've spoken about this a lot on the podcast, with regards to the Premier League, but for many of the modern systems, it seems fullbacks are arguably almost the most important structural pieces in the team. Is this the case in Spain?
I mean, structurally, I'd say definitely. I mean, you can say in terms of training and philosophies and etc. When teams want to try and play good football and have a lot of the ball, it's very much about positional play. It's very much about in training you'll have a lot of games with sort of rondos or kind of small-sided games where it basically encourages the players to kind of work and overload, and fullbacks or wingbacks, they're vital in this. They're vital in terms of being that spare option. They obviously give the opposition wingers something to think about. I mean, when you're playing against teams that are playing with wingbacks in sort of modern football, like in the last couple of seasons, sometimes I would almost say the best thing to do would be to almost sit your own wingers on them or sit your own fullbacks on them in order to kind of peg them back. I mean, wingbacks are just vital pieces in terms of they're definitely someone that teams need to keep an eye on. You obviously can't leave them in acres and acres of space for the switch, so it can stretch teams. A lot of the time now, I mean, with Jaume Costa and Mario Gaspar at Villarreal, both of them can deliver. Mario especially, I mean, he's earned Spain call-ups off the back of the fact that he is a very interesting, marauding fullback. But I mean, they are just vital, really. I mean, whenever it comes to you'll have these sort of rondos where, say if you had a 3v3 inside a square, for example, and then you had a few players on the outside of the square that couldn't come in, but they were involved, and the idea would be that when one team has possession, they can use these players on the outside as walls, sort of thing. I mean, the fullbacks are the walls in this, really. That's when you take rondos, when you kind of extrapolate it out of the training drill where you're trying to keep the ball off people and work these numerical advantages, when it comes down to playing on an 11-a-side field, when you're sort of, I suppose in these sort of drills, you want to be keeping the ball in small spaces, sorry. I mean, as you saw, for example, with Guardiola's Bayern Munich, they would like to keep the ball at high tempo in a small space and then look to switch it. And this would be encouraged by when you had rondos in training, whatever, you would have these players on the outside of the square that couldn't come into the square. And obviously, they opened the pitch up massively. And these, the wingbacks in Villarreal's system, they are these pieces. You can keep the ball in these short spaces, you can move it, you can drag the opposition over to force them to come and get the ball off you. And ultimately, the wingbacks are these spare men, that they are the ones that stretch the opposition, and they're the ones that give you that outball that sometimes you need, regardless of how good your technicians are.
Okay, we have one more video coming out in the La Liga Tactics series. We're going to cover Las Palmas. Simon, can you give us a little indication of what we can expect from that?
Well, Las Palmas, there's two teams in La Liga that have already gone through 3 coaches this season, which seems quite crazy. But not too long ago, Paco Gémez, he's been appointed, that will previously be known from, he managed Granada to not a great deal of success. He managed Rayo Vallecano on a shoestring budget to just keep fighting and playing a really aesthetically pleasing style of football. And then he went off to Cruz Azul in Mexico. Things maybe didn't go as well as he might have hoped, but he's now back in La Liga and he's a big personality. Eventually the video will kind of get through to the contemporary, to the modern day, to what Gémez is going to be looking to do. His first game will be at home in the Copa del Rey against Valencia on the evening of the 3rd of January. And the games are going to come thick and fast in January in La Liga. You've got the Copa del Rey and you've also got obviously league games. So he'll be looking to make some changes very, very quickly. He's already said that he would want 8 players at least to go. That even includes their top goal scorer Loic Remy. He'll probably leave. So they are going to be making a lot of changes. And it will also kind of hark back to this season. I mean, they started the campaign with Manolo Marquez, who was promoted from getting their second team promoted from the 3rd division in Spain. He came in and then resigned, and he had his reasons for that, which he'll explain. Then Paco Ayestaran, he came in having come off the back of doing dreadfully at Valencia last season. He came in, had a chance to extend his losing streak to a La Liga record run, and then he went. So it's basically going to talk through the problems at Las Palmas this season, what's gone wrong, what Gémez is going to offer, and seeing as they're coming into the new year really, really struggling and looking like they could go down, despite having some really, really talented players, it's kind of going to look through what they've done wrong and how they can kind of amend things.
Okay, and finally, before I let you go, who's going to win the league?
Who's going to win the league? This is always an interesting question, but I mean, given the fact that after El Clasico, Barcelona, they've managed to open up, like a 14-point lead, even though Real Madrid have got a game in hand, something like that. You can only say Barcelona at this point. They look balanced. They look like they can maintain the momentum. If they can add a couple more interesting players in January in terms of offering some pace, you've had the likes of Philippe Coutinho mentioned. He would be a very, very interesting addition as well. I mean, basically they are signing to consolidate what they already have, and they're signing to balance the squad that already looks quite good. You look at the likes of Real Madrid; they've got no identity. I think that kind of they're going to be putting their eggs in the Champions League basket already. If they get knocked out of the Champions League, I don't really see a future for Zinedine Zidane at the club, regardless of the fact that obviously he has done so well for them in such a short period of time. And then I don't think that Valencia potentially have the resources to kind of keep pace this season. I mean, maybe in 2 years' time, yeah, sure. But with Atletico Madrid, finally, I mean, obviously they're still, they went unbeaten in the Liga for so long. They've now got Diego Costa back. They have Vitolo to call upon. But I don't think that they're going to be gaining enough ground to kind of keep pace with Barcelona. I think that they can probably be confident of a top 3 finish. I think Diego Costa is a really big signing for them. But I just can't really see anyone catching Barcelona at this point.
Okay, I do promise to let you go after this one, but Philippe Coutinho, you mentioned him there. If he goes to Barcelona, is he supposed to just be a replacement for Iniesta eventually? How do you see him being used?
I think that's kind of been the line that a lot of people have taken for a long while, because obviously this kind of transfer saga, it goes back a few windows. The Catalan press are always very, very keen to push this idea, and obviously the easy sort of dots to join would be the fact that obviously Iniesta, although he's signed this lifetime contract with the club, that's it's not the reality, is it really? I mean, he's been very, very good this season, but you would think that next season will be where he's used a little bit here and there as and when. But just see how things go. You would see someone like Coutinho, in terms of his skill set, in terms of his elegance, he would be a very much a player that can sort of slot into a role where he is very neat and tidy on the ball. He can offer end product. He can offer the final ball. He offers maybe a bit more of a goal threat in central midfield than Barcelona have had for quite a while now. So he'd definitely be an interesting player. I could definitely see that he would come in and he would immediately obviously challenge Iniesta for that role. You're not going to be spending around 150 million euros total for a player and not expecting him to play at least once every 2 games. I think that'd be a bit insane, and it could almost free Iniesta to come into the game in the last half an hour rather than maybe be taken off after the hour. So it'll be interesting. Obviously, they've got a couple of competitions to weigh up. They've got the Copa del Rey, which will make things a little bit, the schedule a little bit jammed this month. Then you've got obviously the Champions League, where there will be a little bit of rotation here and there. And if there's one manager rather that can successfully sort of manage a transition from a great like Iniesta into a player such as Coutinho, who seems to kind of have that ability to maybe not hit the heights of Iniesta, but he's much better than what they currently have in terms of being that creative presence that can offer some goals and end product from midfield. Valverde will know exactly how to use him, and I think that gradually it was something interesting that I saw from Guardiola when Valverde very first took over at Barca. He said that first of all he would win over the players, and after that he would win over the rest. And I think that this group very much trusts in Valverde. He's a very clever man. He's a very well-spoken man. He's a very likeable man. And really he would be the kind of person that you would want in charge of such a big changing of the guard, I suppose it would be described as.
Okay, Simon, thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah, no problem. It's been a pleasure anytime.